Welcome to The Kingstonian, a podcast that profiles people who are passionate about what they do for a living, what organization they belong to, or the community they are a part of. Here is your host, Dave Cunningham.
Thank you, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the story of the 250-watt radio station that could, and the man who passionately promotes it any time he has the opportunity. The radio station is Amherst Island Radio, legally known as CJAI-FM at 92.1. And the man is Eric Tremblay, the president of the station's board. Exciting times for CJAI. They have received approval to boost their power from 250 to 4,800 watts. And as we record this episode in late May of 2021, they were in the midst of a fundraising drive to build the tower. Here is that conversation. Eric, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Dave. A pleasure to be here, of course.
I wanted to talk about the station and the current campaign, but I thought I would talk a little bit about you before we get into that. Obviously, your presence is quite formidable on social media when it comes to the radio station, but this is your hobby, not your real job.
That's right. You got that exactly right.
Now, what is your real job? Just so we get that part clear.
Sure. I work at Queen's University in Kingston, and I'm the director of the engineering teaching and learning team. And I've been associated with the university for a long, long time, but in my current incarnation, I've been working with the Faculty of Engineering and Applied Science for about 7 years, helping lead a sort of mini center for teaching and learning that's engineering specific. So it's really fun to support instructors and anyone who's doing teaching in the faculty to do great work.
Now, how did you get the interest in radio? Where did that come from? Were you in radio before as a young teen?
It turns out I have no experience. I have zero experience in the field at all, and I actually came to it quite serendipitously, really. So about, 13 years ago or something like that, I moved out of downtown Kingston to Loyalist Township. And then it took me about a year or two to figure out that only a stone's throw away from me now was an independent volunteer-run radio station on Amherst Island. I had a contact named Kathy Christmas, and Kathy was doing a radio show over there, and she invited me there one time to join her in studio. And frankly, it was a bit of a thrill because my entire life I've been like a music junkie. And although I have no musical talent to speak of, I've always been a huge fan. Like I grew up in Southern Ontario, I grew up in Windsor, and I was heavily influenced in the 70s and early 80s by everything that was going on in Detroit, because Detroit was massive for music in that decade, 2 decades. And so, when Kathy invited me on and said, Eric, we get to pick our own music. And I said, what? So she invited me on, and it's a really funny story because I remember being there at the radio station kind of in a surreal state. And the first time she pushed the talk button and the white on-air light came on, I was frozen in fear from the occurrence. But, that the sort of teaching skills jumped out, right? Like, I've experienced nerves teaching and doing all those educational things, and I just know that when you're stuck in a spot like that, all you got to do is start talking, right? Just start talking, and it'll unlock. And that's exactly what I did. And the rest is history, Dave. I've now been volunteering at the radio station for a decade.
Now, what was your first show? What kind of music were you playing?
Basically, the idea is, I did a couple guest spots with Kathy. And then Kathy had a fantastic opportunity where she became a loaned representative to the United Way. So she needed to take a sort of mini sabbatical. And she was on a Friday night. Her slot was Friday night. So I became the default Friday night sort of replacement person. And it was really, really fun. And in the early days, the thing that was so motivating to me is I could play songs that weren't more than 3 minutes long. Because about 10 years ago, that's what you were really hearing on the radio a lot. It's 3-4 minute songs. Everything was really packaged and really starting to get formatted. And I thought, well, there's so many great long songs that are on the radio too. So I would go and pull out all these great classic rock tunes from the 70s and stuff, 8-minute songs or 9-minute songs that you just never heard on the radio, but were just awesome. So I really got a lot of thrills behind playing stuff like that.
Now, Amherst Island Radio started, 2006, I think was the year. So this is year 15.
Yeah, 2006.
Now, whose idea was it to start the radio station?
Yeah, so it's a little bit before my time. So basically, I can only recount to you what is now legend, what is now lore in the books. But for those listeners that are out there right now that know anything about island communities or extremely small rural communities, one thing you will know is they have a common thread. And the common thread is resourcefulness. So it's often a bunch of people that just decide one day they're going to do something and they don't really care what other people think, and they don't really care that they're not experts in it either, right? They're going to figure it out, right? And they're going to be resourceful. And I guess the way it's been explained to me is about 15, 16 years ago, it was just a kind of perfect storm where there was a few people on the island that were passionate about media. And one of them was Peter Truman, who is ex-Global TV anchor. He had moved to the island while he was entering closer to retirement. And he had a lot of experience, of course, around everything media and helped folks understand how to format a radio station, how to work a radio station. And then Tom Richmond, Rosemary Richmond were a married couple that also had lots of skills. Tom himself was an electrician. So he was definitely interested, and he could learn how to, do the wiring of a radio station, how to set up the radio station. And then it just went up and down the line. People just said, well, I'm a carpenter. I can do this. And I can help with find a location for the radio station, et cetera, et cetera. And they just put old-fashioned island resourcefulness all to bear. And they did the impossible. They actually built a radio station on an island with no internet.
Now, what I'm curious about too is at some point you have to go to the CRTC and say, "Give us a license, please."
Yeah, again, I'm only recounting stories for sure, but some of the resourcefulness for sure came from Peter. So Peter had the contacts in the business, right, and certainly could leverage some of the contacts he had to provide the right kind of expertise to mount the right kind of application. And they did it in baby steps. So at first they got a 5-watt developmental license, okay, which basically meant that it was a sort of technical proof of concept, if you will. And that was an interesting time. One of our longest running broadcasters, Ellis Wolfries, started 1 month into that particular period, 1 month after the radio station was created. And he had a very popular program where basically what he would do is pretty much just do live music. So he would invite all kinds of folks to come and do live music. And he tells me stories that the 5-watt radio station, the signal was so weak that people actually had to drive to the Millhaven ferry dock, park on the ferry dock to hear the radio station. And he said it was wild. Like, people were so excited to hear their friend or their family member or their neighbor playing music on the radio, they were willing to drive to hear the radio station and basically park on the ferry dock. So stories like that are crazy to me when you think about it. And then they just took next logical steps. Once for a year, they had that proof of concept running, and then they just decided, okay, what's the next step to try to get themselves a 250 watt protected contour. And they did. At 93.7 was that first frequency with a protected contour. And eventually they had to change to the current frequency, which is 92.1. They stayed at the same power. But now we're on the verge of massive expansion because, as most people know in the community, the CRTC has now approved us to go from 250 watts to 4,800 watts. And we're going to be switching to 101.3 as a result. So it's all just been an evolution. And it's just a crazy bunch of volunteers who just decide to do stuff and they get it done.
I think one of the interesting aspects of the station is the fact that there are no paid staff. It's all 100% volunteer run.
That's correct. In the very beginning, we had a couple of grants, for example, that sustained the energy that we needed from people to sort of get things off the ground. But certainly, since I've joined the radio station, I've been there like more than a decade, we have never had a payroll. There's none of that going on. It's just a bunch of committed individuals that are passionate about basically passionate about everything local. We have people that are passionate about local business. We have people that are passionate about local music. We have people that are passionate about local events, live events, even a lot of nature things. Like we have a very, very popular birding show. You name it, we want to showcase it when it comes to Amherst Island Radio, and that's why the programming is so diverse.
Now, give me an idea of what your reach is with your tower at the moment at 250 watts.
Yeah. So for listeners that are listening right now in the Kingston area, so we're on the far west side, and our signal penetrates into about midway through Kingston. Gardner's Road. Once you start to cross over Gardner's Road, it gets real sketchy depending on, how close you are to a red light or, what kind of magnetic field you're getting off the truck beside you. And if we go in the other direction, we're okay in Napanee, but pretty much the second you leave Napanee, it gets really, really sketchy. And then, of course, once you hit the Glenora Ferry, for example, if you're on your way to Picton, the signal starts to erode. And so that's the 250 watt configuration. Once we see ourselves at the 4,800 watt configuration, you can only imagine now how far that we're going to reach. Kingston's going to be solid. Everyone in Kingston basically is going to be able to hear us. What we're really striving for is we're the only radio station in Loyalist Township, the only one. And so this was a real opportunity now to capture the entirety of Loyalist Township. So, for example, the northernmost community of Wilton is really underserved with services, and our radio station right now doesn't even reach it. So with the new configuration, we'll definitely be solid in Wilton. And of course, all our friends in Napanee won't have anything more to complain about. And then there'll even be people as far away as Picton that'll be able to hear.
Now, the other question I wanted to get to was describe the format of the station. What are you playing on the station?
Yeah, so it's pretty eclectic, and one of the things that we really try to do is try to be a reflection of the community, right? That's really sort of been one of the underlying themes that we've wanted to emphasize over time. So we have a sort of an open call where we ask anyone in the community to just come forward and pitch something, right? Just pitch us something. And, we've had some interesting pitches over the years. And we always try to find the person's passion point and to then channel that passion point into something that can creatively work on the radio. So the station doesn't have a format from that perspective. Basically, the idea is the broadcaster that's in the chair has 100% creative control over what's going on during their show. So when I talk about diversity, you're going to see all kinds of stuff. Like I talked moments ago about the birding show. It sounds crazy that we could have a show where all they do is talk about birds. But I'll tell you, it's one of the most popular shows. And when I'm traveling the community and asking for reaction from people, it gets brought up an above average amount of times how they love the birding show. And if you haven't heard it, they actually talk about birds. Like, these are the birds that we saw this week. We saw them here on the corner of this road and that road. We saw 17 of them. And it's kind of riveting when you hear the passion of the broadcaster. So that's one of the wins. It's making sure that you're working with a broadcaster who has passion, finding that passion point, and then just letting them do what they love, right? We have yet other broadcasters that are passionate, let's say, about live music. Okay, so a fellow like Bon Evans, Carrick McAllister, Jack Mead, these folks are really, really passionate about in the moment performance type events, and so we've transformed the entire studio into a performance studio. Right now, it's the major signature sponsor is Amherst View Foodland, and so we call it the Amherst View Foodland Performance Studio on the island, and we have all kinds of events that happened in that studio. Last year, even in a pandemic, we had upwards of 150 live events that occurred inside the station that are simulcast. They're simulcast on the FM signal, on the internet stream, and we will also push them out on social media streams. So we're really trying to do maximum reach. And these are a few examples of the kinds of programming that we have. We also have standard music shows, people that like heavy metal, they just want to make a heavy metal show. People like rap or hip hop, they just want to do that. And people that, of course, like that sort of morning show type mix where they can basically have a couple guests in, phone interviews. You name it, we do it.
Now, as a guy who used to be involved in radio myself, I'm just curious to know, do you have any regulatory items you have to keep in mind when you are programming your station or allowing your volunteers to program your station?
Yes. So community radio stations have pretty much the same license as the campus radio stations, but with some additional, let's say, a couple of constraints that have been removed. But the ones that are obvious are Canadian content. So we have to make sure that we have tons of Canadian content. And we do an audit about once a year on our Canadian content. And last time we did the audit, we're upwards of 53% Canadian content. And it just goes to show you how passionate our broadcasters are about everything local. We play a ton of local music, and it's never been a challenge for us to reach the quote-unquote quota of Canadian content. The one that we have far greater challenge meeting is the spoken word one. So, for those that have been involved in sort of radio in the past or maybe are interested in radio in the future, what we've learned is that doing a music-related show is kind of easy. You just spin songs and you talk a bit, and sometimes you'll take a listener request or two. But doing a spoken word show is kind of hard because it's amazing when you try to fill up 30 minutes or 20 minutes or even longer with speaking parts, how much preparation you actually need to have in those settings. So it's been a challenge over time for us to recruit. You know it. You're doing podcasts, right? Same game, right? Yep. It's been a challenge to recruit enough folks to meet those quotas. So pretty much year over year, we always flirt with our 15% requirement for locally produced spoken word.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I'm sure you'll agree with is the fact that in this community, we are very fortunate to have an awful lot of very talented local musicians.
Oh yeah. And in fact, for us, it's somewhat challenging. Like we have a large music database and, a lot of people are telling me, let's grow it all the time. And I say, slow down. Let's not grow it too hard, because one thing we always want to do is add the local music first. And there's just so much local music and quite diverse in the number of genres that are associated with it, that is a steady stream of new music that is really on tap and it comes in all the time. And a couple of years ago, we also decided that, okay, there's an opportunity for us to do even more, okay? Because not only do we have local musicians in to do live gigs, we play local music on the radio, but still we could do more. So we launched a kind of a sister station a couple of years ago called radiofreestella.com. And the pitch behind this particular station is all it does is play local music. Nothing but local music, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's an internet-only radio station. And we've defined local somewhat broadly. Okay, so we've defined it anything from Belleville to Brockville to north of Highway 7. And what this really does is make a crazy mix of really cool tunes. So pre-pandemic, I used to listen to it basically in the car, at least one way every day, because I just loved the mix of hearing the diversity and the talent that was in this region. Post-pandemic or during pandemic, I got to tell you, I'm listening to it a little bit less because I'm not trapped in my vehicle. But when I do put it on, it's just so fun to see the diversity and the diversity in time, because it's just not artists from the region that are active now, but it's those from the past. You don't hear those people on the radio. They're just not on the radio, but they are at radiofreestella.com.
That's right. There's a lot to choose from. Let's talk a little bit about the finances and how you exist, if you will. I know that you don't have a salary to pay anyone, but you still have things you have to pay for. So how do you do that? Yeah,
so traditionally the number one piece of revenue that we have at the radio station is donations. And that's, that's not the common format, I would say, for most radio stations in Canada. Most radio stations in Canada, especially the commercial radio stations, the number one revenue stream that they have is from advertising sales. So for years, what we did is we relied on the goodwill of the community, essentially, to sustain the radio station. And because our sort of bills, our actual, operating costs were so low, it actually worked. It really worked to rely on the community. Where over the last 3 years, though, we've had a kind of a turning point, if you want to think about it like this. Because about 3 years ago, what happens is our landlord for our current building, a fabulous gentleman named Dale Gowan, came to us and said, "Hey, folks, make a plan. Start to make a plan to move the radio station." Because he was very jovial about it. He said, "Listen, I'm getting old, and one day, I'm not going to be around anymore, and you're going to have a problem if I'm not your landlord." And he was very frank about it, right? And it's very real to talk about this. And so, about 3 years ago, the board of directors had to decide, first of all, faced with this new challenge, what were we going to do? Was it going to be move the radio station, but basically stay in a status quo kind of format or spirit? Or were we going to move the radio station and try to grow? And we decided that the growth plan was a better plan for us at the time because, frankly, the thought of moving a radio station, including transmitter, including everything like that, is so daunting. And to do it for little gain was not appetizing to anybody around the table. So if we were going to move, we were going to grow this thing.
Now, when you decided to sit down and think about the business of growing the radio station, I'm curious to know what the current atmosphere is for radio in terms of getting your hands on a frequency and more power at this particular point in radio. Do you have a sense of that? Was it easy? Was it hard?
Yeah, that was a good point. So we knew that when we needed to grow, that we couldn't grow at our current frequency of 92.1 because there's an adjacent frequency at the Cave, KCVI's high school radio station, that has a protected contour. In fact, we supported their application for a protected contour several years ago. So it was clear to us when we started to make our decision to grow that it was going to involve a frequency change. So, we did the right thing. We got ourselves a professional broadcasting engineer to analyze the spectrum. And it turns out, luckily, the Kingston region is not the same thing as the GTA in Toronto, where it's so congested that there's really no choices. It turns out there are choices here in this market. And so our broadcasting engineer served up 2 or 3 different choices, and we landed on 101.3 as the one that was sort of like the best of all the constraints sort of thing. And so there's even more frequencies available in town too. So it's nice to see that there's a little bit of lack of congestion here and allowing a little bit of degrees of freedom, because otherwise we would have been painted into a corner to stay at 92.1.
Right. Okay. So you've got a campaign that is currently underway. The cost of the whole campaign to move the transmitter and set up your internet and get everything going, new studios and all of that sort of thing, is about $200,000. Correct?
Yeah, you're pretty close. The $200,000 does not include moving the studio.
Okay.
Believe it or not.
Okay.
The $200,000 is basically what we're doing is we're erecting our own 130-foot telecommunications tower. So we're going to own it. We're going to own our own tower. And what we're doing is we're doing this in partnership with Kingston Online Services. So they are a popular rural internet service provider in the region. And one thing that has been plaguing this island forever is very, very poor internet service, especially on the south side of the island, where a shadow is created by a high ridge down the center of the island. So all mainland services like cell towers and stuff like that are just really, really poor on the south side of the island. And now we found a location on the island that's far more central. So we're going to be erecting this brand new tower very central to the island. And at the same time as we stabilize this radio station's transmitter and antenna for 20 years, we're now going to bring new infrastructure choices to the residents of the island for their internet choices. So it's kind of like a win-win-win kind of a situation,
right,
because we're making this community investment not only in the radio station, but in this very important public good, which is the internet. We all know during the pandemic, like, people need this to survive. And with Kingston Online Services, we're going to be bringing it in a better way to Amherst Island.
And where are your studios going to be?
So I'm not embarrassed to say this, but I don't know. So in a very measured way, when we were faced with the initial challenge, when the board was faced with the initial challenge of moving this radio station, we scoured all the sites on the island that were potentials. I think, if memory serves me correctly, 3 years ago, we came up with 9 potential new sites for the broadcasting studio. When we did the analysis and the comparisons between everything and the negotiations, we found no site of those 9 that could co-locate the transmitter and the broadcasting studios in an efficient way. The reason why this was an important analysis is because right now that's our current configuration. Our transmitter and our antenna is co-located with our broadcasting studio. So after about 6 months of working on this, we decided, okay, it's too hard to try to get an all-in-one solution. We need to split the problem into smaller pieces. And first, we decided, okay, the first piece is we need a new tower, and we need to boost the signal. And the rationale behind that was, if we can boost the signal, then we can possibly grow our advertising revenue, right? Right now we have 79 different small businesses that partner with us on an annual basis for very, very inexpensive advertising packages. We basically charge $2 a commercial. It's very inexpensive. And so, if we could turn around to the community and say, okay, well, now we're going to go from 250 watts to 4,800 watts, maybe we could grow the revenue stream a little more, right? And as well as I do that money gives you choices. And if we had just a slightly higher revenue, then, making the realities of a new broadcasting studio somewhere else on the island that's not co-located, the realities become a lot more real. So the board that's the back half of this year's job for the board. They have to find a new location for the broadcasters, for the broadcasting studio.
Now, as we record this particular conversation in the middle of May, where do we stand in terms of what your funding campaign looks like? Where are you? Yeah,
so we started the year in kind of bad shape because what we did is last year, in response to the pandemic, we canceled our annual fund drive. We only do one a year. We do it like clockwork in the month of May, basically leading up to the long weekend. So that was an acute pandemic, very unstable time last year in April and May. So we just decided to pull the pin. And it basically put us an entire year behind, if you will, on our finances, especially given the fact that I mentioned earlier that our number one revenue stream is donations from people. And if we just shut the door on donations, we really shut the door on the revenue stream. And so this year we had to rethink the process and really kind of do like 2 years in one with a fund drive. And it, frankly, I'll be very frank, it is super scary, Dave. Like, it is super scary to launch a fund drive with a goal that is stratospheric. Like, it's psychologically very stratospheric. So what we did is we turned around and we said that this year's goal was going to be to raise $70,000. And many of the folks on the fundraising committee were like quaking in their boots. Like, we would say the words $70,000, but we wouldn't even believe we could do it. We just don't believe we can do it. But we were those people on our team that are from the island said, it doesn't matter what other people believe. It doesn't matter what you might believe. You don't succeed if you don't try. There are a lot of folks that support this radio station for 15 years. Those folks will continue to support. The challenge now is making the people who have maybe never donated before, how to motivate those people. And then, again, the challenge in how to do it during a pandemic time where there's a lot of sort of income insecurity in the region. So a lot of challenges were against us, but we did it. We launched $70,000 and we smiled and we went for it. And right now we're about 2/3 of the way into the fund drive, but we're only about the halfway mark. We've raised about $35,000. So we're off the pace, if you will. We're off the pace for reaching the $70,000 goal, But we are still excited that we're sitting here today speaking in the middle of May, and $35,000 has made it into the coffers during this drive.
So you've been very successful with your fundraising campaigns in the past. You've got a lot of support in the community, and I'm sure hitting that $70,000 mark is going to be one that you will achieve. You may be a few days past your deadline, but I'm sure you're going to make it. And all the best to you, and I want to thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure, Dave. I really appreciate you reaching out.
Eric Tremblay, president of the board at Amherst Island Radio. And if you want more information about the current campaign or the station itself, head over to CJAI.ca. This conversation was recorded in late May 2021 using Zoom.
The theme music for the podcast is Stasis Oasis, written and performed by Kingston musician Tim Aylesworth. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions about any of the episodes, please send a note to thekingstonianpodcast@gmail.com. For details on upcoming guests, follow us on Facebook. The Kingstonian Podcast is hosted by Dave Cunningham and produced in Kingston, Ontario, Canada.